my scary Reddit readings. And I said I wasn't going to do any more scary Reddit readings. Well, I began to scour Reddit again for some scary stories to read to you. And then I began to read and search through some of the creepypasta because somebody, I can't remember who, asked me if I could read some of the creepypastas. And I thought it over, and I realized that I can't do it. Last time, I seriously creeped myself out. I creeped myself out so much that I said, I'm not doing them anymore. So, I'm going to have to hold to that until such time as I can rebuild my nerves to read such stories. But that doesn't mean I can't tell you a story. So, what I've decided to do is to tell you a story. And it will be a story that I have made up. It probably won't be scary. It will probably bore some of you. But who knows? Maybe some of you might find it interesting. I'm going to do my best to make it up off the fly. Well, it won't be completely off the fly because it won't be completely off the fly because I have kind of been thinking about it when I was at work about what to say. And so I've already kind of got a story laid out in my mind. So I'm going to go ahead and start and catch you up to where I stopped. And then I'm going to have to do some freestyling as far as the story, telling of the story goes. I'm not going to freestyle rap. I can't do that. That's a talent I don't possess. But, alright, here we go. This story is the story of J. Sang Burroughs. J. Sang Burroughs was born and raised in Mississippi. And he was the black sheep of his family. They made fun of him, they picked on him, and they would make him cry, and he was just seemingly treated unfair. He would go home, and this is the treatment he got at home. But when he would go to school, he would get the same treatment, much to his surprise. He would get bullied, and he would get picked on and pushed around. And it was really putting him in a bad place. And then he'd go home expecting to be loved, but all he ended up experiencing was the same type of bullying, the same type of pushing around. He would go to his dad for advice, and his dad seemed to tell him the only advice he could get from his dad was, you just need to man up and stand your ground. Um, but that's when he could speak to Dad. A lot of times, Dad was too busy with work, and the time that he could spend with them was minimal, but it was necessary to keep their household going. Um, Even sometimes Mom didn't have time for him, and sometimes he would discover that she would side with his older brother or his younger sister in the cases he brought to her. It just seemed like he couldn't catch a break. Even his relatives that lived nearby kinda made him the butt of their jokes. In fact, the only person he could really depend on to lift his spirits and to love him the way that he thought that he should be loved was his grandma. Now, his grandma was a very, very special woman. Out of everyone in his family, he felt more closely related to her. He didn't even feel this kind of love for his grandpa. And his grandma was the one that kept him from going to that dark place. And she told him that he's being bullied for a reason. This is his life. And she would encourage him um, to not let it push him to this bad place that he felt. She would tell him that sometimes she would watch him be bullied and she wouldn't say anything. She wouldn't defend him. She wouldn't fight for him. And her explanation was this was something that he had to do. He had to stand his own ground. He had to grow on his own. But she could guide him and showed him how to let love and peace and tranquility shape and mold him, and how to deflect um, the jokes and the terrible feelings that would come his way, the attacks on his character and on his person. She showed him how to block and deflect and not let those things affect him. By the time he was a teenager, he had excelled at this. Pretty soon, Jay Sang grew up. He became an adult man. He had gone to college, and when he was finished college, he joined the military. And when he got out of the military, he came back home and he went into business for himself. But the military life called upon him again, and he went back into the military. He never married. He never really had a lasting relationship. There was just something about him that caused him to be a loner. While he was in the military, he still had problems finding his center. So he turned to martial arts. He turned to a Bushido style of fighting and fighting with weapons to teach him how to shape his body and control his body, and thereby he could learn how to control his mind and thus find his center. Even though he got very good, he still felt like there was something bigger coming. And when he turned 30, that something bigger came. It started with his grandmother's death. The one person in this world that he truly, truly, deeply loved, and who truly, truly, deeply loved him. She was now gone. So he packed up his bags. He moved back to Mississippi because he didn't really own much anyway. He drove his car back to Mississippi. And when he got to Mississippi, he moved into his grandmother's house. And they had the funeral. On the day of the funeral, he just felt odd. Everyone was crying and sad, but he didn't cry. He wasn't sad. Well, he was sad. He was hurt that Grandma had passed. But there was something about his grandmother. He just felt like she wasn't really dead. He felt like she was in his heart. And his younger sister got up to read a eulogy, but she was too broken up by grief to continue. And so he got up and he took the paper. He went up and he read her speech. And without knowing why, he began to address the crowd. And he told them, she's not dead. She's moved on. She's become one with the ether. Even though she may be gone, but I don't feel she's truly gone. I feel that she's still here with us. I feel as if she's waiting on something. What that is, I cannot tell. But let's look at her life. Let's look at what she's taught us. She taught us not to love and to weather the storm and to press ahead despite the things that come our way. Aside from being our parent and aside from being our progenitor and spending time with us, she's really taught us all how to live. And as he continued his speech, he began to smile brighter and brighter and bigger and bigger. And through these streaming tears, he gave this speech. And it was a speech of such magnitude that it lifted the spirits of everyone there. People began to stop crying and they just stood there and they stared at him. They were just so amazed at his words of endearment and encouragement. And he finished his speech. And he said, she may not be here with us physically anymore, but she is always in our hearts, and we should not forget her example. And with those words, he got up, he went back to his seat and sat down. After the funeral, Everyone told him how amazed that they were at his words. On that day, his family had learned to respect him. He would no longer be the butt of their jokes. He would no longer be someone to push around, for he had earned their respect and their love. A week later, there was the reading of grandmother's will, and everyone from the family was invited. And the lawyer began to read off to them everything their grandmother had left to them. To their surprise, their grandmother was incredibly rich. She had a few $1,000,000, and they had no idea she had this much money. And she began to divide it. The lawyer began to read off to them who was getting what. And it seems of her 7 sons and her 4 daughters, each one of them would get a few $100,000. And to the children, a few $1,000,000. And to her grandkids, a few $100,000. Everyone either got money or property. Everyone, with the exception of Jay Sang. To Jay Sang, the lawyer said, "I leave 7 acres of land just behind my house in this black box." Jay Sang, he didn't make any motion. There were snickers heard, but they were quickly muffled. He got up and he went forward and he picked up the box, and it was a metal box, no bigger than a box for holding a brand new pair of boots. He walked back to his seat and he sat down, and then he opened the box, and the only thing in the box was a old alarm clock and a long silver and black cylinder and a smaller box. No money, no trust fund, nothing of value on this earth, with the exception of the deed for the 7 acres behind her house, the house which she left to his younger sister with some money. So Jay Sang was somewhat surprised. He began to have feelings rise up. No one laughed at him, but their looks were strange, as if, "You got money and you didn't." He began to feel that maybe Grandma thought less of him. He began to feel that he was actually the butt of Grandma's joke. That she would leave him the 7 acres behind her house. The 7 acres behind her house was a wasteland. It wasn't good for growing anything. It was really only good for clearing off and maybe building some houses there and selling them. But when it rains, the land floods. The 7 acres that she gave him was, for all its intents and purposes, good for nothing. But Jason felt, as he began to thought about all the lessons that his grandma taught him over the years, he began to correct himself. And he stopped those lying, evil thoughts that he could possibly be the butt of Grandma's jokes. I mean, Grandma never made jokes about him. Grandma never made fun of him. She was always there to encourage him. She was always there to teach him. He always felt like there was something more going on than what she was letting on, because she taught him things that she didn't teach the others. They did have their little secrets. When he was a teenager, he discovered that he could move objects. He tried it with a bottle cap, and his older brother saw it. And his brother obviously, clearly didn't believe him. And he said, "Oh, it's just magnets." And then he left. But Jay Sang discovered he could do this with wood and with paper. And he showed his grandma what he did. And she made him stop. She told him that it's okay, but it's probably best you don't show anybody else that. And then she reached over, outstretched her hand, and the remote lifted itself off of the television set and floated into her hands. And she began to explain to him, "You have it. You have that thing that I have." She began to teach him about it and how to use it and when to use it and how not to use it. And it became their secret. He never once betrayed her trust and showed anyone. Jay Sang sat in his sister's house, in what was his grandma's house, now his sister's house. And she and her husband, they talked and they were discussing what they were going to do with the house. And Jay Sang, or Jason as they called him, began to open up his box and examine his gifts that his grandmother left him. And he heard a puff from behind him, and his sister came up behind him. "I'm so sorry. I thought Grandma was better than that. I didn't know she would be the prankster and play the biggest joke on you. But it is what it is." She said, "If you want, you can have the house." Jay Sang thought about it, and he was like, "No, it's your house. She left it to you. It's yours. But I'll tell you what I am going to do." And he pulled out the paper the envelope with the deed, and he gave it to her with an additional letter. He said, I already talked to the lawyer, and I've ceded the land to you, my 7 acres in the back. And she was like, well, I don't really want it. He was like, well, your husband's a sportsman. Maybe you could use it for hunting. Maybe you can do something with it. I can't. I'm moving back to California. And she was like, okay. And with that, she and her husband began to pick up the kids, and they left the house and left Jason alone to lock up. Now, when Jason was alone, he began to closely examine the things that his grandma left him, because he felt like there was something more to this. He took the cylinder, the silver and black cylinder, and he looked at it. It had buttons on the side. He didn't bother to push any of them. He set them aside. He set it within the brown holster that came with it. He pulled out the clock. He began to realize there's something about this clock. He pulled that to the side, and he pulled out the smaller box. He opened it up, and inside were parts. It's a puzzle. Grandma loved puzzles. He would often do them with her. Sometimes her puzzles were so complicated that she felt that it required an additional mind to do. But he realized that was her way of teaching him how to do the puzzles himself. He put the puzzle together, and he began to see that the puzzle needed something on the inside. And that's when he looked at the clock. The clock looked funny. It looked like it was cobbled together. So he began to take the clock apart. And he discovered some of the pieces in the clock fit the box. They fit inside the box. And right at the center of the box was a big circle. And he took the last of the clock. Right behind the clock's face was a blue cylinder. It was like a jewel of sorts. He slid that inside the clock. Then he closed the clock up. And he looked at it. It was a perfect pyramid. And as he looked at it, he began to move the sides of the puzzles into different size and the different slots, and move them within their facets. And then he began to think about it, and he just had this feeling that there was something more to it. And as he concentrated on the clock, he began to feel. He remembered that there were some facets on the inside. He couldn't reach in the pyramid physically and move those facets, but he could move them with his mind. And as he began to move them into their respective facets, a light began to glow above the top of the pyramid clock. And as he sat back, he realized this was a silhouette of his grandmother. And the little model of his grandmother, it was clearly a younger, thinner version of her. And he looked at her, and she just stared up at him, blinking and motionless as if she was waiting for him to speak. And he said, "Grandma?" But she just looked and blinked. And then there was a name that he remembered, something that Grandma told him concerning the puzzle that he put together. And he said, "Zeiss Tesser." And then she said, "Hello, Jason." And this blew his mind. And he said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Zeiss Tesser. I am the avatar of this particular holocron." Now, Jason didn't know what to think. So he started off with the simplest questions he could think of. What's a holocron? And the apparition before him began to explain to him that a holocron is a device for containing the knowledge of the creator of the said holocron, and that the holocron contained all the knowledge of the creator of it, and he would do well to learn from it and to use his information wisely. And he must have sat there all night listening to this holocron, soaking in the knowledge, asking it every question he could. And finally he asked, "Where are you from?" And the holocron began to tell him about a galaxy far, far away from his own. And it showed him a planet. It was a planet completely clad in metal. It was a beautiful planet, and as they got closer and closer, it took him into a ziggurat, a tower that towered above all the other metallic buildings. It was a pyramid in the middle with four stanchions surrounding it, and they were pointed at the top. And she said, the avatar said, "This is the Jedi Temple. This is where you must go. You must return this holocron to that temple." And he said, "Me?" And the avatar began to explain to him what he must do. And when he was finished and asking questions, and when the holocron had finished answering questions, it shut off. And he began to find that he could finally sleep now. And he laid down, but sleep eluded him. But he was so excited about what was going to happen and what he must do. And finally, sleep took him. In the morning, before the sun rose, he got up, he showered, he ate his breakfast, and he got dressed in his classic brown boots, blue jeans, shirt, and a jacket. He strapped the cylinder around his chest, and it came around. It acted as a holster, except instead of holding a gun, it held the cylinder. He took the pyramid, and he took the remnants of the clock, and he went out to the spot that the holocron laid out for him. When he was in the very middle of the 7 acres, or at the very edge of the 7 acres, he began to do some breathing techniques. He relaxed himself, and then he began to feel. He noticed as he began to feel with his mind, he realized that there was something beneath the earth. And he took his time and breathed and relaxed until his mind had fully caressed the surface of this object beneath the earth. And he imagined himself scooping his fingers into the earth. He took a deep breath, and he began to lift. At first there was resistance, but he began to lift even more, until finally the earth before him in his mind began to buckle and to break apart, and the trees began to fall, and something was rising up out of the earth, and it rose above the ground, up into the sky, and he turned, and it turned, and the remnant of the trees and the earth and the rocks fell to the ground, and before him was a spaceship. He was so surprised. He began to maneuver it over to a flatter part of the ground, and he sat it down in a position that he believed was right side up. Before he sat it down, the landing gear began to land, to eject. And now the spacecraft was sitting on its own struts. He walked towards it, hardly able to contain himself. He picks up the holocron in the middle box, and he walks, and he admires the craft as he walked around it. And as he came around the left side, he noticed that a panel had slipped open and it led down. And so he walked over to it. And when it had led down, he looked up and realized it was a ramp. He began to board the ramp, but 3 metal robots began to clamp down. The one robot was clearly different from the other 2. The other 2 had narrow necks and skinny heads, and they chirped in a mechanical but squeaky fashion. And they reached on their backs and pulled out the items that was attached to their backs. And those items, Jason quickly recognized, they had space guns. The robot in the middle with his arms seemingly permanently attached to his waist began to move and to make speaking a language that Jason didn't understand. And so when the robots approached with the weapons, he raised his arms and he said, "Please, don't shoot." The robot in the middle stopped, and it began to do what Jason assumed was a diagnostic. And then the robot said, "Please repeat yourself." And he said, please don't shoot." And the robot made another sound as if it was adjusting itself. And then finally it said, "I am SOYT. I am a protocol droid. I am programmed for human relations, for interrelations with being, for communications." Okay, I'm messing this up. I'm programmed for communications. I am a protocol droid. State your name in business. With his hand still uplifted, he explained that he was chasing and that his grandmother sent him here. The protocol droid replied, "I am not familiar with your grandmother." And then Jason began to look down and to look around, trying to figure out what he could say before he was blasted. And he said, Zeiss Tesser sent me." And the robot began to recognize the name. "Oh, Master Tesser sent you. I should have noticed you have Master Tice's weapon. Please surrender Master Tesser's weapon to me." And Jason pulled it out, and he held it, and the two robots flanking with the weapons immediately took closer aim. And he said, "Slowly, relax, it's okay." And then the protocol droid said, "Float it over to me." And Jason took the weapon, and he was about to toss it, and then he stopped and he said, "Wait a minute." He thought the protocol droid asked me to float it over to him. So he used the technique that his grandmother had taught him, the technique that he used to uncover the spaceship. And he floated the cylinder into the waiting hands of the robot. And once he did so, the other droids put up their weapons and they turned and they boarded the craft. The protocol droid said, "Thank you," and turned to walk away, and then stopped and turned and said, "Are you coming?" And of course, Jason smiled and he said, "Of course I'm coming." And he picked up the metal box and he walked up the ramp, but then he stopped and he turned and he took in the 7 acres that his grandma had given him. He looked at the house, and then he thought about the planet Earth that he was on, and he realized that he was about to leave and he was never coming back. He realized that this is the reason why he could never marry, he could never settle down, why he could never keep a job after he got out of the military. He went from job to job, and he just seemingly wasn't happy. He had traveled all around the world. He'd fought in wars, and he got none of that. Anything he did, he found no satisfaction. But he realized now, as he boarded this craft, that this was what he was looking for. And he walked up the craft into the dim light of the craft, and the door raised behind him, and the craft raised into the sky and shot off into the distance. Okay, I'm gonna end the story right there. I had to do some improvising a little bit there, but I hope you enjoyed it. And to those of you who are Star Wars fan, you probably know where I'm going with this. But instead of telling you a different story, I think I'm gonna keep to this story for the next video, and let's make this a thing. Let's make this a segment where I make up a story and tell it to you guys. How does that sound? Okay. Well, it's late, and I do have 2 more days of work this week. But we'll finish the story later, okay? This is Smilin Observer